I'm Sage Johnson, 42 years old, and 3 years ago, a teacher told my daughter she'd never amount to anything because of her race. The words hit me like a physical blow, but what the school district did next was even worse. If you've ever experienced racism in education, please let me know where you're watching from and subscribe to join others who understand this struggle. My journey to that devastating moment began 20 years earlier when I was a young teacher myself, fresh out of Hampton University with a degree in elementary education and dreams bigger than the small minds that would try to contain them. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a house where my grandmother's cornbread recipe was passed down alongside lessons about dignity and perseverance. Mama always said, "Baby girl, you got to be twice as good to get half as much, but don't you ever let that make you half the woman you're meant to be." Those words became my armor as I navigated rooms where I was often the only black face, speaking up in meetings where my ideas were overlooked until a white colleague repeated them minutes later. My early career was a masterclass in resilience. I started teaching fourth grade at Jefferson Elementary, where the principal, Mrs. Henderson, took me under her wing. She was a black woman who'd fought her own battles in education for 30 years, and she taught me how to document everything, how to speak with authority that couldn't be questioned, and how to build relationships with parents that would become my foundation. I remember the first parent-teacher conference where a white father questioned my credentials, asking if I was really qualified to teach his gifted son. Henderson appeared in my doorway like an angel, rattling off my achievements and degrees with such pride that the man practically shrank into his chair. "That's how you handle doubt," she told me later. "You don't argue with ignorance, you bury it with excellence." I threw myself into my work with the passion of someone who knew that my success was never just about me. Every lesson plan I crafted, every student I inspired, every reading score I improved was a victory for every black educator who came before me. I spent my evenings earning my master's degree from VCU while volunteering at my church's after-school program, where kids from the neighborhood knew they could always find a safe space and someone who believed in them. My apartment was always full on Sundays, with my sister Keisha bringing her famous mac and cheese while we listened to gospel music and planned community events. Those gatherings were where I recharged, surrounded by people who understood that success wasn't about assimilation, but about lifting each other up. 5 years into my career, I was recognized as Teacher of the Year for Richmond Public Schools. The ceremony was beautiful, held at the downtown convention center with my entire family in attendance. Daddy wore his best suit, the navy one he saved for church and special occasions, and Mama cried when they called my name. My students had made a banner that read "Miss Johnson Changes Lives," and seeing their proud faces in the audience reminded me why I'd chosen this path. The recognition opened doors I'd only dreamed of. I was invited to speak at education conferences, consulted on curriculum development, and eventually recruited by Westfield County, an affluent suburban district that was finally acknowledging its need for diverse perspectives in leadership. The transition to Westfield was like stepping into a different world. The schools had resources I'd never seen, technology that actually worked, and class sizes that made individualized attention possible. I was hired as a curriculum specialist, a role that would put me on track for administration. The salary was nearly double what I'd been making, and for the first time in my life, I could afford to buy a house. A real house with a yard and a two-car garage, in a neighborhood where my future children could ride bikes safely. I was 28 years old, newly married to Ron, a social worker who shared my passion for community building, and the world felt full of possibility. During my peak years at Westfield, I flourished in ways I hadn't imagined possible. I developed reading programs that closed achievement gaps, mentored new teachers who sought me out for guidance, and slowly built a reputation as an innovator who got results. The superintendent, Dr. Patricia Williams, a black woman who'd broken barriers in her own right, became my mentor and advocate. Under her guidance, I completed my doctorate in educational leadership while working full-time, often studying in the teacher's lounge during lunch breaks or at the kitchen table after dinner. Ron would find me there at midnight, surrounded by research papers and curriculum guides, and he'd bring me tea and remind me that I was changing the world one lesson at a time. My involvement in the community deepened as my career progressed. I joined the local NAACP chapter, organized back-to-school drives that provided supplies for hundreds of students, and started a scholarship fund for first-generation college students. On Sundays, I taught Sunday school at Macedonia Baptist Church, where Reverend Thompson always reminded us that education was the pathway to freedom that our ancestors died for. Those words stayed with me during the challenging days when I felt the weight of being one of only 3 black administrators in a district of 50 schools. When Ron and I welcomed our daughter Zara 8 years ago, I felt like my life had reached its perfect balance. She was born during winter break, and I spent those first precious weeks marveling at her perfect little fingers, while planning how I would shape a world worthy of her brilliance. Zara was curious from the beginning, always asking questions that made me think, always observing the world with eyes that missed nothing. I knew she would face challenges I hoped my generation had eliminated, but I was determined to give her every tool she would need to succeed. The pinnacle of my career came when I was promoted to Assistant Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction, making me the highest-ranking Black administrator in Westfield County's history. The position put me in charge of educational standards for all 47 schools in the district, with a staff of 12 and a budget that could impact thousands of students. I had an office with windows overlooking the district's flagship high school, where graduates regularly went on to Ivy League universities. My nameplate read Dr. Sage Johnson, and every time I saw it, I thought about my grandmother, who cleaned those same types of offices for 40 years, never imagining her granddaughter would one day run one. But even at the height of my success, I noticed the subtle signs that would later seem prophetic. There were the meetings where my ideas were met with polite smiles and no action, while similar suggestions from white colleagues were implemented immediately. There were the comments about my passionate delivery style when I advocated for equity initiatives, coded language that I recognized but couldn't directly challenge without seeming defensive. There were the times when parents questioned my authority in ways they never would with my white counterparts, asking to speak with someone in charge, even when I introduced myself with my full title. The microaggressions accumulated like paper cuts, each one small enough to dismiss, but collectively creating a wound that never quite healed. During budget meetings, I noticed how my requests for resources in schools with higher minority populations were scrutinized more heavily than requests for affluent schools. When I proposed professional development on culturally responsive teaching, the response was that we needed to focus on more pressing priorities. When I suggested recruiting teachers from HBCUs to diversify our staff, I was told that we hired the best candidates regardless of where they went to school, as if excellence and Black institutions were mutually exclusive concepts. The most telling moment came during a leadership retreat where we discussed the district's achievement gap. I presented data showing clear correlations between resource allocation and student outcomes, with schools serving predominantly white students consistently outperforming those serving students of color. The response from several board members was that socioeconomic factors were the real issue, not institutional bias. When I pointed out that middle-class Black students in our district still underperformed compared to white students of similar backgrounds, the room fell uncomfortably silent. Dr. Matthews, the white male board president, suggested that perhaps cultural factors were at play, a comment that made my stomach turn but which no one else challenged. That retreat happened on a Friday in October, and I spent the weekend processing the implications of what I'd witnessed. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Anytime I raised issues of equity or pointed out racial disparities, I was met with deflection, dismissal, or coded language that placed blame on communities rather than systems. I realized that my position, while impressive on paper, came with the unspoken expectation that I would be grateful for my seat at the table and wouldn't rock the boat too vigorously. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning that started like any other. I dropped Zara off at Maplewood Elementary, the district's most diverse school, where she was thriving in third grade under Mrs. Rodriguez, a teacher who understood how to nurture gifted children of color. Zara hugged me goodbye and ran toward the building with her backpack bouncing, excited about a science project she'd been working on for weeks. I drove to the district office, feeling proud of the life we'd built, unaware that everything was about to change. My childhood was shaped by Sunday dinners at Grandma Rose's house, where the smell of fried chicken and the sound of Mahalia Jackson filled every corner with warmth and wisdom. Grandma Rose had worked as a domestic in white households for 60 years, and her stories taught me early that dignity wasn't something that could be taken away, only something you could choose to surrender. She would tell me about the families she worked for, how they spoke about Black people when they thought she couldn't hear, and how she held her head high anyway because she knew her worth wasn't determined by their ignorance. Those family gatherings were my foundation, where I learned that excellence was our family tradition and education was our pathway to freedom. My father, Robert, was the first in his family to graduate from college, working his way through Virginia State while supporting his younger siblings. He became an engineer at Philip Morris, one of only a handful of Black professionals in the company, and he taught me that success meant opening doors for others, not just walking through them yourself. My mother, Gloria, was a nurse who worked double shifts to help pay for my education, and she showed me that caring for others was both a calling and a form of resistance against systems that devalued Black lives. The talk about navigating white spaces came gradually woven into everyday conversations about school and friendships. When I was 12 and excited about being selected for the gifted program, Mama sat me down and explained that I would be one of only a few Black children in those classes. "Baby," she said, "you're going to have to work twice as hard and be twice as smart, and some people still won't see your worth. But you remember where you come from. And you remember that their blindness doesn't dim your light." She taught me about code switching, how to speak the language of predominantly white institutions while never forgetting the richness of my own cultural expressions. Daddy's lessons were more direct. He taught me to document everything, to never attend important meetings alone, and to build relationships with other people of color who could serve as witnesses and allies. "The game is rigged," he would say, "but that doesn't mean you can't win. You just have to play it smarter than they expect." He told me stories about being the only Black engineer in meetings, how his ideas were ignored until white colleagues presented them as their own, and how he learned to navigate office politics while maintaining his integrity. My professional identity was forged in the predominantly white spaces of education, where I learned to translate my passion for social justice into language that wouldn't threaten white comfort. I became fluent in the subtle art of pushing for equity while making it seem like everyone's idea. I learned to present data in ways that couldn't be dismissed, to build coalitions that included white allies, and to pick my battles strategically. Being the only one in rooms became so normal that I stopped noticing the isolation until someone else pointed it out. At conferences and professional development sessions, I gravitated toward the small communities of Black educators who understood the unique pressures we faced. We would share strategies for dealing with difficult parents who questioned our authority, swap stories about microaggressions that others might not recognize, and support each other through the emotional labor of being pioneers in spaces that weren't designed for us. These connections became my lifeline, reminding me that I wasn't imagining the challenges, and that my experiences were part of a larger pattern of systemic exclusion. The mentorship piece was crucial to my identity as an educator. When young Black teachers joined the district, they inevitably found their way to my office, seeking guidance on everything from classroom management to career advancement. I remembered my own early years and how Mrs. Henderson's support had made all the difference, so I made it my mission to be that person for others. I organized informal networks, recommended people for leadership opportunities, and shared the unwritten rules that no one had taught me but that I'd learned through trial and error. October 15th began like any ordinary Tuesday. I arrived at the district office at 7:30 a.m., my usual time, carrying my travel mug filled with coffee and my leather portfolio stuffed with agenda items for the day's meetings. I had dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one that conveyed authority without being threatening, paired with pearls that Mama had given me for my doctoral graduation. I felt confident and prepared, completely unaware that by day's end, my faith in the institution I'd served for 15 years would be shattered. The morning flew by with routine meetings about budget allocations and standardized testing schedules. I reviewed data from the previous quarter, noting with satisfaction that several schools had shown improvement in reading scores after implementing programs I'd developed. During lunch, I called Ron to check in about Zara's pickup arrangements, and he mentioned that she'd been unusually quiet the night before when working on homework. "Maybe she's just tired," I said, making a mental note to spend extra time with her that evening. At 2:30 p.m., my assistant buzzed me with a message that would change everything. "Dr. Johnson, there's a Mrs. Patricia Whitman here to see you. She says it's about her son Tommy and some incident at Maplewood Elementary." I recognized the name immediately. Tommy Whitman was in Zara's class, and Mrs. Whitman had a reputation among parents as someone who wasn't afraid to voice her opinions. I assumed this was a routine parent concern, perhaps about curriculum or classroom dynamics. Mrs. Whitman entered my office with the kind of confidence that comes from never having your authority questioned. She was a tall, thin woman in her late 30s with perfectly styled blonde hair and designer clothes that cost more than most teachers made in a month. She sat down without being invited and placed her expensive handbag on my desk like she owned the space. The entitlement in her posture immediately put me on guard, but I maintained my professional demeanor. "Johnson," she began, her voice carrying the particular tone that white women used when they were about to say something they knew was problematic. "I need to discuss the situation with Tommy and your daughter. Apparently, there was some sort of altercation during group work yesterday, and Tommy came home very upset. Her emphasis on your daughter carried an undertone that made my stomach tighten, but I kept my expression neutral and asked her to continue. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as if she were sharing a confidence rather than making an accusation. Tommy said that Zara was being very aggressive during their science project, taking over and not letting the other children contribute. When he tried to suggest a different approach, she apparently got very angry and told him he was wrong. The teacher had to separate them. She paused, studying my face for a reaction. I'm concerned about this pattern of behavior. It seems like Zara has some anger issues that might stem from cultural differences. The words hit me like ice water, and I felt my professional mask beginning to slip. I knew exactly what she was implying with cultural differences, and the suggestion that my brilliant, gentle daughter was somehow naturally aggressive made my hands clench under the desk. But I had been in situations like this before, and I knew that reacting emotionally would only confirm her biases. Mrs. Whitman, I said carefully, I appreciate you bringing this to my attention. Can you tell me exactly what Mrs. Rodriguez said about the incident? Her response revealed the depth of her entitlement and prejudice. Well, I haven't actually spoken to Mrs. Rodriguez directly, but Tommy is very reliable, and he's never had problems with other children before. I think it's important that we address this before Zara's behavior affects other students. The implication was clear. My daughter was the problem, and the solution was to contain her rather than investigate what had actually happened. I felt the familiar sensation of being in a racial minefield, where every word had to be carefully chosen to avoid confirming stereotypes, while still defending my child. I'll certainly speak with Mrs. Rodriguez to get the full picture, I said, keeping my voice level. In my experience, group project conflicts are usually about different working styles rather than aggression. I was giving her an opportunity to walk back her implications, to choose a more generous interpretation of children's behavior. Instead, she doubled down with the kind of casual racism that elite white women had perfected. Dr. Johnson, I know you care about Zara, but sometimes parents are blind to their children's faults. I'm sure this comes from the environment at home, the way Black families, well, you know how they can be more emotional and confrontational. It's not anyone's fault, but it is affecting my son's education. She said it with the tone of someone offering helpful advice, as if she were doing me a favor by pointing out my child's racial deficiencies. The room seemed to tilt, and I felt that familiar combination of rage and disbelief that came with experiencing overt racism from someone who would never admit to being racist. She had just told me that my daughter was genetically predisposed to aggression because of her Blackness, and she'd done it with the smile of someone who considered herself enlightened. I took a deep breath, drawing on 30 years of experience navigating white supremacy, and prepared to respond with the kind of controlled precision that had served me throughout my career. When I called Mrs. Rodriguez that afternoon, the real story emerged with painful clarity. There had indeed been a conflict during the science project, but it was Tommy who had dismissed Zara's ideas without consideration, telling her that girls don't understand engineering and that her design was stupid. When Zara calmly explained why her approach would work better, citing principles they'd learned in previous lessons, Tommy had become frustrated and complained to Mrs. Rodriguez that Zara was being mean to him. The teacher had separated them, not because of Zara's aggression, but because Tommy couldn't handle being corrected by a Black girl who knew more than he did. Mrs. Rodriguez, a Latina educator with 15 years of experience, had witnessed the entire interaction and was appalled by Mrs. Whitman's characterization of events. Dr. Johnson, she said, her voice heavy with frustration, Zara is one of the most thoughtful, collaborative students I've ever taught. She always includes everyone and goes out of her way to help struggling classmates. What happened yesterday was about Tommy's discomfort with being challenged by a girl who's smarter than he is, not about Zara's behavior. She paused before adding, I've seen this pattern before with certain families in our district. That evening, when I sat down with Zara to discuss the incident, my heart broke at what I discovered. My brilliant, confident daughter had internalized the message that her intelligence was somehow threatening to others. Mama, she said, her voice small and uncertain, Tommy said I was being bossy, and Mrs. Rodriguez moved me to work alone. Maybe I should just let other people be the leader from now on. In that moment, I saw how quickly the world was trying to dim her light, how early the messages began that Black girls needed to make themselves smaller to be acceptable. I held her close and told her the same things my grandmother had told me, that her intelligence was a gift to be celebrated, not hidden. But privately, I was devastated by how quickly the poison had started to work. At 8 years old, my daughter was already learning to question her own worth, to wonder if her excellence was somehow wrong. The system was working exactly as designed, teaching Black children to diminish themselves before anyone else had to do the work of oppressing them. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Principal Davidson at Maplewood Elementary to address the incident formally. I had worked with Davidson for 3 years and considered our relationship professional and respectful, so I expected a straightforward conversation about ensuring accurate information and preventing future misunderstandings. I brought documentation of my conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez and entered the meeting prepared to problem-solve collaboratively. Principal Davidson, a white man in his 50s who had led Maplewood for 8 years, greeted me with the kind of forced warmth that immediately signaled trouble. He offered coffee, commented on the weather, and engaged in small talk that felt designed to delay the real conversation. When I finally steered us toward the purpose of my visit, his demeanor shifted to what I recognized as damage control mode. "Dr. Johnson," he said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone that white administrators often used when they were about to gaslight a person of color. "I want you to know that we take all parent concerns seriously, and we're committed to creating a positive learning environment for every child." The words were right, but the subtext was clear. This was about managing complaints, not addressing injustice. I presented the facts I'd gathered from Mrs. Rodriguez, explaining exactly what had happened during the science project, and pointing out the discrepancies in Mrs. Whitman's account. I spoke calmly and professionally, sticking to observable behaviors and documented conversations. I expected him to acknowledge the misunderstanding and discuss how to prevent similar situations in the future. Instead, Principal Davidson began what I now recognize as a masterclass in institutional gaslighting. "Well, Dr. Johnson, we have to remember that children's perspectives can be very different from adult interpretations." Tommy felt upset, and Mrs. Whitman was responding as any concerned parent would. "Perhaps we're all reading too much into what was probably just a normal childhood conflict." He said it with the tone of someone being reasonable, as if my concern about racial bias was an overreaction rather than a legitimate response to documented prejudice. When I pressed him on the cultural differences comment and Mrs. Whitman's implications about Black families, his response revealed the depth of institutional complicity. "Dr. Johnson, I wasn't there for that conversation, so I can't comment on specific words that may have been said. But I do think it's important that we don't assign negative motivations to parents who are simply trying to advocate for their children. Mrs. Whitman has always been supportive of our school community." The message was clear. A white parent's comfort was more important than addressing racism against my child. The meeting ended with Principal Davidson promising to keep an eye on group dynamics in Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom and suggesting that perhaps Zara might benefit from some social skills coaching to help her work more effectively with diverse personalities. I left that office feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach, realizing that the institution I'd served for 15 years was willing to sacrifice my child to protect white parents from the discomfort of examining their prejudices. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in my professional career. I called in sick and went home to think. I sat in my kitchen, staring out at the yard where Zara played on her swing set, and tried to process what I'd experienced. The woman who had built her career on collaboration and system change was forced to confront the possibility that some systems weren't interested in changing. They were only interested in managing the appearance of equity while maintaining the reality of white supremacy. The retaliation began subtly, as it always does in professional settings where outright discrimination would be too obvious. Within a week of my meeting with Principal Davidson, I noticed that I was being excluded from email chains about curriculum decisions that directly affected my department. Meeting invitations that should have included me were sent to my subordinates instead, with apologetic follow-up messages about communication errors when I inquired about my absence. Matthews, the board president, who had made the cultural factors comment at the leadership retreat, began scheduling one-on-one meetings with my staff members, ostensibly to better understand the curriculum department's priorities. When I asked my team about these conversations, they reported questions that seemed designed to undermine my leadership. Was I approachable when they had concerns? Did I seem open to different perspectives? Was I perhaps too focused on certain issues at the expense of core academic priorities? The most devastating blow came during the monthly administrators' meeting in November. I had prepared a presentation on literacy interventions that had shown remarkable success in closing achievement gaps, particularly for Black and Latino students. The data was compelling, the methodology was sound, and the results exceeded our most optimistic projections. I was excited to share the success and advocate for expanding the program district-wide. Dr. Sandra Mitchell, the white female superintendent, who had replaced Dr. Williams the previous year, introduced my presentation with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. But as I moved through my slides, I noticed a series of micro-expressions and body language cues that made my stomach sink. Eye rolls between board members, whispered conversations during my data presentation, and the kind of polite nodding that signaled minds that had already been made up. When I finished my presentation and opened the floor for questions, the response was devastating in its calculated dismissiveness. Board member James Peterson, a retired businessman who had never worked in education, led the charge with questions that revealed the depth of their resistance to equity initiatives. Dr. Johnson, while these results are interesting, I'm concerned about the cost-effectiveness of interventions that seem to benefit only certain demographic groups. Shouldn't we be focusing on programs that help all students succeed? The question was a racist dog whistle wrapped in fiscal responsibility, implying that programs that helped Black and Latino students were somehow discriminatory against white children. Before I could respond, board member Lisa Hoffman chimed in with her own concern. I also wonder if we're creating dependency by giving some students extra support that others don't receive. Are we really preparing them for the real world, where they'll need to compete on an equal playing field? I felt the room's energy shift as other board members picked up the thread, each adding their own version of the same racist argument. Helping Black children succeed was somehow unfair to white children, and addressing systemic inequities was actually creating new forms of discrimination. They spoke about merit and fairness and equal treatment, as if the playing field had ever been level, as if centuries of educational apartheid could be ignored in favor of colorblind policies that maintained white advantage. My response was measured and professional, drawing on research and data to counter their arguments. I explained how targeted interventions actually benefited all students by improving overall school culture and academic achievement. I provided examples from other districts where similar programs had been successful. I spoke about the moral and legal obligations we had to address educational inequities, but I could see in their faces that they had already made up their minds before I entered the room. The final blow came from Dr. Mitchell herself, delivered with the kind of sympathetic tone that made it clear she had been coached on how to handle this moment. Dr. Johnson, we appreciate your passion for these issues, and your dedication to student success is evident. However, the board has some concerns about the direction of our equity initiatives. We need to ensure that our focus remains on academic excellence for all students, and some of us feel that identity-based programming might be dividing our community rather than bringing it together. In that moment, I understood that this wasn't really about budget concerns or academic effectiveness. This was about a white-dominated institution's comfort with gradual, non-threatening change that didn't challenge fundamental power structures. My success in closing achievement gaps was seen as a threat because it proved that the racial disparities they'd always attributed to cultural factors were actually the result of systemic discrimination that they were complicit in maintaining. The meeting ended with my program being tabled for further study, which I knew was administrative code for being permanently shelved. As I packed up my presentation materials, I felt the crushing weight of understanding that my position as assistant superintendent was only valuable to them as long as I focused my energy on problems that didn't implicate their own racism. The moment I provided evidence that their system was failing Black children by design, I became a threat that needed to be neutralized. Walking to my car that afternoon, I thought about Zara and the conversation we'd had the night before about her science project. She had asked me if she should try to be less smart so that other kids would like her better, and I had assured her that her intelligence was a gift that the world needed. But sitting in my car outside the district office, I wondered if I was lying to both of us about what kind of world we were actually living in. The escalation continued through December with a systematic campaign to undermine my credibility and isolate me from the decision-making processes I had been hired to lead. The pattern was sophisticated and deniable, the kind of institutional retaliation that left fingerprints everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Email chains that included everyone except me, meetings scheduled during my known conflicts, and decisions made about my department without my input became the new normal. The most painful part was watching colleagues I had considered allies participate in my professional exile through their silence. Teachers and administrators who had sought my mentorship and guidance suddenly seemed too busy for the informal conversations that had been the foundation of our relationships. The few who did speak to me privately expressed sympathy, but explained that they couldn't afford to be seen as taking sides in what they characterized as a political situation. Dr. Mitchell began scheduling monthly check-ins that felt more like interrogations than supervisory meetings. She would question my time management, my communication style, and my ability to build consensus around initiatives. The feedback was always vague and impossible to address. I was told that I seemed defensive when challenged, inflexible in my approach to problem solving, and divisive in my focus on equity issues. The December board meeting included a presentation on refocusing our educational priorities, which was essentially a public rejection of everything I had been hired to accomplish. Board President Matthews spoke about the need to return to colorblind educational policies that focused on merit rather than identity politics. The language was carefully chosen to sound reasonable, while effectively dismantling every program that had successfully supported students of color. When the floor was opened for public comment, I watched in horror as Mrs. Whitman approached the podium with a folder full of documents. She had somehow organized a group of white parents who shared concerns about the district's divisive focus on racial equity. One by one, they testified about their children feeling left out of programs designed to support underrepresented students, about curriculum that made white children feel guilty about their race, and about the need to return to educational approaches that didn't favor certain groups over others. Mrs. Whitman's testimony was the most devastating because she had positioned herself as a reasonable voice concerned about all children's welfare. She spoke about the incident between Tommy and Zara, characterizing it as an example of how aggressive approaches to equity were creating hostile environments for white children. She never mentioned my daughter by name, but everyone in the room understood exactly who she was talking about and what she was implying about. Black students who dared to excel. I want to be clear, she said, looking directly at me from the podium. This isn't about race. This is about creating educational environments where all children can succeed without being made to feel bad about who they are. When we focus too much on certain groups, we create resentment and division that hurts everyone. Her words were met with applause from the white parents in attendance, while the few black families present sat in stunned silence. The board's response made their allegiances clear. They thanked Mrs. Whitman and the other parents for their thoughtful input and promised to carefully consider their concerns. No one questioned the obvious contradictions in their arguments. No one pointed out that the programs they opposed had documented success in improving outcomes for all students, and no one challenged the racist assumptions underlying their testimony. As I drove home that night, I realized that I was witnessing something I had read about in history books, but never expected to experience personally. The organized resistance of white parents to educational equity, wrapped in the language of fairness and equality. It was Brown versus Board of Education, all over again, with the same arguments and the same barely concealed racial animosity, just updated for contemporary consumption. The final straw came in January during what was supposed to be a routine meeting about the upcoming school year's budget priorities. I had prepared a proposal for expanding successful intervention programs and was ready to present data showing their effectiveness and cost efficiency. Instead, I walked into a meeting that felt like a professional ambush designed to justify a decision that had already been made. Dr. Mitchell began the meeting by announcing that the board had decided to restructure the curriculum department to better align with their new educational priorities. The restructuring involved eliminating my position as assistant superintendent and creating a new role focused on academic excellence rather than equity initiatives. The position would be filled through a competitive search process that would allow the district to find someone whose vision better matched their current goals. The language was corporate and sanitized, but the message was clear. I was being fired for doing exactly what I had been hired to do. My success in closing achievement gaps and supporting students of color had made me a liability in a district that preferred the comfortable myth that racial disparities were about family values rather than institutional racism. When I asked for clarification about the timeline and process, Dr. Mitchell's response revealed the calculated nature of their plan. Dr. Johnson, we want to make this transition as smooth as possible for everyone involved. We're prepared to offer you a generous severance package and excellent references if you're willing to resign voluntarily. We think that would be the best outcome for both you and the district. The offer of references was particularly insulting, implying that my professional reputation was theirs to control. I looked around the room at faces I had worked with for years, people who had praised my leadership and celebrated my achievements when it was convenient for them. Now they sat in uncomfortable silence, unable to meet my eyes, complicit in my professional execution through their cowardice. The only sound was the scratching of Dr. Mitchell's pen as she took notes about my response to feedback and willingness to collaborate on solutions. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of accepting their generous offer to disappear quietly, Instead of taking their severance package and pretending that none of this had happened, I looked Dr. Mitchell in the eye and said the words that would launch my fight for justice. I'll need some time to consider your offer. I assume you'll be documenting the specific performance issues that led to this restructuring decision. Her face went pale, and I knew that she understood exactly what I was really asking for. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and began documenting everything I could remember about the past 4 months. Every meeting, every comment, every email, every witness to the systematic retaliation I had experienced. I called my mentor, Dr. Williams, who had retired but maintained her connections in the education world, and she listened to my story with growing outrage. "Sage," she said finally, "this is exactly what happened to me in my first superintendency. The only difference is that you have documentation and witnesses. It's time to fight back." Over the next week, I consulted with 3 different civil rights attorneys, each of whom confirmed what I already knew. I had a strong case for racial discrimination and retaliation. The pattern of targeting me for implementing successful equity programs, combined with the organized parent campaign and the board's decision to eliminate my position, created a clear picture of institutional racism that any reasonable jury would recognize. The choice before me was clear but terrifying. I could accept their severance package, find another position in a different district, and try to rebuild my career while staying silent about what had happened. Or I could risk everything I had worked for to expose a system that was willing to sacrifice Black educators and students to maintain white comfort. I thought about Zara, about the message my choice would send her about fighting for justice versus accepting injustice for the sake of peace. The decision became easier when I remembered something my grandmother used to say, "Baby girl, sometimes the right thing to do is the hardest thing to do, but you'll never regret standing up for what's right. You might regret staying quiet, but you'll never regret speaking truth to power." I picked up my phone and called attorney Sarah Hassan, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in education discrimination cases, and scheduled a meeting for the following Monday. The formal legal process began with a filing that sent shockwaves through the district and the broader community. Attorney Hassan submitted a comprehensive complaint to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, documenting the pattern of racial discrimination and retaliation I had experienced. The filing was also sent to the State Department of Education and leaked to local media outlets who had been covering education issues in the region. Within 48 hours, the story was front-page news in 3 different newspapers and the lead story on every local television station. The headlines were everything the district had hoped to avoid. Top Black administrator claims racial discrimination in prestigious school district, equity programs under fire, as lawsuit alleges retaliation, and parent campaign against diversity initiatives prompts federal investigation. The community response split along predictable racial lines, but with some surprising allies emerging from unexpected places. The local NAACP chapter organized press conferences supporting my case, while several white parent groups defended the district's right to set educational priorities without federal interference. But most importantly, current and former Black educators began sharing their own stories of discrimination, creating a chorus of voices that made it impossible to dismiss my experience as an isolated incident. Mrs. Rodriguez, Zara's teacher, became an unexpected but crucial witness when she submitted a formal statement detailing the original incident between Zara and Tommy, as well as her observations about how the district had handled similar situations involving Black students and white parents. Her testimony provided crucial evidence that the pattern of discrimination extended beyond my personal experience to affect Black children throughout the district. The district's initial response was a masterclass in damage control and victim blaming. They released a statement expressing surprise and disappointment at my allegations, emphasizing their commitment to diversity and inclusion while questioning my motives for pursuing legal action. They characterized the restructuring of my position as a routine administrative decision based on budget constraints and evolving priorities, with no mention of the racial dynamics that had actually driven their actions. Dr. Mitchell attempted to control the narrative through a series of carefully orchestrated media appearances, where she spoke about the district's achievements in supporting students of all backgrounds. She highlighted their diversity statistics, their inclusion policies, and their commitment to equitable education, while carefully avoiding any specific discussion of my case or the equity programs that had been eliminated. The message was clear. They were the real champions of diversity, and I was a disgruntled employee trying to play the race card for personal gain. The breakthrough came when attorney Hassan obtained internal emails through the discovery process that revealed the true motivations behind the district's actions. Email chains between board members and Dr. Mitchell showed explicit discussions about the SAGE problem and strategies for managing the equity issue without appearing racist. Most damaging was an email from Board President Matthews suggesting that they needed to find a way to neutralize her influence before she causes more division in our community. One email from Dr. Mitchell to her assistant was particularly devastating. "We need to document performance issues that justify removing Dr. Johnson from her current role. Her focus on equity initiatives is creating problems with key stakeholders, and the board wants her moved to a less visible position." Another email thread discussed the parent complaints about my aggressive approach to addressing discrimination, with board members agreeing that they needed to restore balance to their educational priorities. The most explosive discovery was a recorded phone call between Dr. Mitchell and Mrs. Whitman, where they discussed strategies for building parent opposition to equity programs. In the recording, Dr. Mitchell could be heard agreeing that certain approaches to diversity were divisive and promising to address the situation in ways that would be satisfactory to concerned families. The recording proved collusion between district leadership and white parents to eliminate programs that supported students of color. As the evidence mounted, the district's legal team advised them to pursue settlement negotiations rather than risk a trial that would expose even more damaging information. Attorney Hassan used the leverage created by the email evidence to demand not just financial compensation for my damages, but also systemic changes that would prevent future discrimination against Black educators and students. The settlement negotiations took place over 3 intense days in a downtown conference room, with lawyers for both sides presenting their cases to a federal mediator. The district's representatives tried to minimize the significance of the email evidence, arguing that internal discussions about personnel decisions were being taken out of context. They offered a modest financial settlement and a neutral reference letter, hoping to close the case quietly without admitting wrongdoing. Attorney Hassan's response was devastating in its thoroughness. She presented a timeline showing the direct correlation between my advocacy for Black students and the escalation of retaliation against me. She played the recorded phone call between Dr. Mitchell and Mrs. Whitman, demonstrating collusion between district leadership and white parents. She submitted testimony from other Black educators documenting similar patterns of discrimination, proving that my experience was part of a broader institutional problem. The moment that changed everything came when Attorney Hassan presented evidence that the district had eliminated successful equity programs, despite their documented effectiveness, purely to appease white parents who complained about reverse discrimination. The federal mediator, a Black woman with 30 years of experience in civil rights law, looked directly at the district's lawyers and said, "Gentlemen, you have a significant problem here. This isn't about personnel management or budget constraints. This is about a pattern of racial discrimination that violates federal law." The district's legal team requested a recess to consult with their clients, and when they returned 2 hours later, their entire approach had changed. They were now prepared to offer a comprehensive settlement that included financial compensation, policy changes, and a commitment to restore the equity programs they had eliminated. More importantly, they agreed to bring in an independent monitor to oversee the implementation of new anti-discrimination policies and ensure accountability for future actions. The final settlement exceeded even Attorney Hassan's most optimistic projections. The financial compensation was substantial enough to provide security for my family while I decided on my next career steps. But more importantly, the agreement required the district to reinstate all equity programs that had been eliminated, implement comprehensive anti-bias training for all staff and board members, and establish an independent ombudsman position to investigate future complaints of discrimination. The settlement also included a public acknowledgement that I had been unfairly targeted for retaliation and that my equity initiatives had been highly effective and beneficial for all students. Dr. Mitchell was required to issue a public apology and announce her resignation as superintendent. Board President Matthews was censured by the state education department and ultimately chose not to seek re-election rather than face a recall campaign. The day the settlement was announced, I stood on the steps of the federal courthouse with Attorney Hassan and representatives from civil rights organizations who had supported my case. The media coverage was extensive, with reporters asking about the broader implications for education, equity, and the message this sent to other districts considering similar actions. My statement to the press focused not on personal vindication, but on the systemic changes that would benefit future students and educators. This case was never about me personally, I said, looking into the cameras that would carry my words to thousands of viewers. It was about ensuring that school districts cannot sacrifice the educational needs of Black children to maintain white comfort. It was about proving that Black educators deserve respect and support when we advocate for equity and justice. The immediate aftermath of the settlement brought a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and hope that I hadn't felt in months. The financial security allowed me to take time to heal from the trauma of the past year while considering my options for the future. But more importantly, the systemic changes we had won created a foundation for lasting transformation that would benefit students and educators for years to come. The district was required to hire a new superintendent through a transparent process that included community input and a commitment to equity as a core qualification. Dr. Carmen Vasquez, a Latina educator with a track record of successfully implementing inclusive policies, was selected for the position. Her first act was to reinstate all the equity programs that had been eliminated and expand them to serve more students throughout the district. The independent monitor, Dr. Angela Freeman, a former federal judge with expertise in civil rights law, began conducting quarterly reviews of district policies and practices. Her first report identified dozens of areas where implicit bias had affected decision-making, from disciplinary policies that disproportionately affected students of color to hiring practices that had maintained an overwhelmingly white teaching force. The recommendations she made became the roadmap for comprehensive reform. The anti-bias training that was implemented for all staff and board members went far beyond the superficial diversity workshops that many districts use to check compliance boxes. Led by experts in systemic racism and institutional change, the training forced participants to confront uncomfortable truths about how their own biases had affected their decision-making. Several board members and administrators chose to resign rather than participate fully in the process, clearing the way for new leadership committed to equity. The most meaningful change was the establishment of the Office of Educational Equity, with resources and authority to investigate complaints, monitor outcomes by race and ethnicity, and recommend policy changes to address disparities. The office was staffed by professionals with civil rights backgrounds who understood the difference between performative diversity and substantive equity work. Community response to the changes was mixed, but generally positive, with many families expressing relief that the district was finally addressing issues they had been concerned about for years. The Black parents who had stayed silent during the height of the controversy began sharing their own stories of discrimination their children had faced, creating a broader understanding of how systemic racism had affected generations of students. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had shown such courage in testifying about the original incident involving Zara, was promoted to an administrative position where she could implement culturally responsive teaching practices throughout the district. Her work became a model for other educators who wanted to create inclusive classrooms where all students could thrive. The ripple effects of our victory extended far beyond Westfield County, as other districts facing similar challenges reached out to learn from our experience. Attorney Hassan began receiving calls from Black educators in different states who were experiencing retaliation for their equity work, and she used our case as a template for building stronger legal arguments. My personal healing journey was complicated but ultimately transformative. The trauma of experiencing systematic racism from people I had trusted and worked with for years required professional support and a lot of soul-searching about my relationship with predominantly white institutions. I began working with a therapist who specialized in racial trauma and found community with other Black professionals who had faced similar experiences. The hardest part was explaining to Zara what had happened and why Mama had to fight against the school district where she was a student. We had many conversations about justice and courage, about standing up for what's right even when it's difficult, and about the responsibility we have to make things better for the people who come after us. Her questions were insightful, and her support was unwavering, reminding me daily why this fight had been necessary. After taking a year to recover and reflect, I decided to use my experience and expertise to help other educators and districts navigate issues of equity and inclusion. I established a consulting firm specializing in educational equity, drawing on both my administrative experience and my hard-won knowledge of institutional racism. The demand for this work exceeded my expectations, with districts across the country seeking guidance on implementing inclusive policies without triggering the kind of backlash I had experienced. My first major consulting contract was with a district in North Carolina that was facing federal investigation for racial disparities in disciplinary actions. Using the framework we had developed in Westfield County, I helped them implement comprehensive reforms that addressed both explicit and implicit bias in their policies and practices. The work was challenging, but deeply satisfying, as I could see the direct impact on students who had previously been marginalized by the system. 6 months after the settlement, I received an invitation that surprised and honored me. Dr. Vasquez asked me to return to Westfield County as a consultant to help implement the equity initiatives required by our agreement. Walking back into the district office, where I had been humiliated and driven out, felt like completing a circle, but this time I was returning with power and purpose. The work of implementing systemic change proved to be just as challenging as winning the legal battle, but in different ways. Changing policies was relatively straightforward. Changing hearts and minds was much more complex. Some staff members embraced the new approaches enthusiastically, while others complied reluctantly or looked for ways to resist without appearing openly defiant. The key to sustainable change was building a critical mass of people throughout the organization who understood that equity wasn't just about following rules, but about creating educational environments where every child could reach their full potential. This required ongoing training, mentorship, and accountability structures that went far beyond what had existed before. 1 year after the settlement, the data showed remarkable improvements in student outcomes across all racial and ethnic groups. Achievement gaps that had persisted for decades were narrowing, disciplinary disparities were decreasing, and survey data showed that students of color felt more supported and valued than they had in previous years. Most importantly, the culture of the district had shifted from one that ignored racial dynamics to one that actively worked to address them. The broader community also began to change as parents and students became more aware of how racism had affected educational opportunities. Town halls and community forums provided spaces for honest conversations about race and education, with facilitators helping people navigate difficult topics in productive ways. Some families chose to leave the district rather than adapt to the new culture, but many more embraced the opportunity to be part of a more inclusive community. My work with other districts began to create a network of educators and administrators who were committed to equity and who could support each other through the challenges of institutional change. We shared strategies, celebrated successes, and provided encouragement during the inevitable setbacks that come with any significant reform effort. The most rewarding aspect of this work was seeing young Black educators who felt empowered to advocate for equity without fear of retaliation. The policies and procedures we had fought to implement provided them with protection and support that my generation had never had. They could focus on educating students rather than constantly defending their right to do their jobs. Looking back on this journey 3 years later, I recognize that my experience in Westfield County was both an ending and a beginning. It ended my career as a traditional school administrator, but it began my work as an advocate for systemic change in education. The trauma of experiencing institutional racism was real and lasting, but it also provided me with insights and motivation that have shaped everything I've done since. The financial settlement provided security for my family, but the real victory was the systematic changes that continue to benefit students and educators throughout the district. Zara is now in 6th grade, thriving in an environment that celebrates her intelligence rather than trying to diminish it. She knows the story of why Mama had to fight the school district, and she understands that her education is built on a foundation of justice that many people work to create. The consulting work I do now allows me to share the lessons we learned in Westfield County with educators and communities across the country. Every district that implements comprehensive equity reforms creates ripple effects that extend far beyond their own boundaries, as students who experience inclusive education become adults who expect and demand equity in all areas of life. My relationship with predominantly white institutions has been permanently changed by this experience. I now approach them with a healthy skepticism and a clear understanding that good intentions are not enough to create equitable outcomes. I insist on accountability measures, data tracking, and monitoring systems that make it impossible to ignore racial disparities or dismiss them as cultural factors. But I've also learned that change is possible when there is sufficient pressure, clear expectations, and ongoing accountability. The Westfield County of today is dramatically different from the district where I was pushed out 3 years ago, proving that even entrenched systems can be transformed when people are willing to fight for justice. The network of allies I've built through this work extends across racial and geographic lines, including white educators and administrators who recognize their responsibility to address systemic racism in their own institutions. These partnerships are essential for creating the kind of widespread change that individual efforts cannot achieve. The legal precedent set by our case has been cited in dozens of other discrimination lawsuits, helping to establish stronger protections for educators who advocate for equity. Attorney Hassan continues to represent Black educators facing retaliation, and our case provides a roadmap for building successful legal challenges to institutional racism. For anyone watching this who has experienced racism in education, whether as a student, parent, educator, or administrator, I want you to know that your experiences are valid and that change is possible. The road to justice is never easy, and it requires courage, persistence, and community support. But every person who stands up to discrimination makes it easier for the next person to do the same. The Black community's response to my story has been overwhelmingly supportive, with many people sharing their own experiences of educational discrimination and expressing gratitude that someone was willing to fight back publicly. These conversations have helped me understand that my experience was part of a much larger pattern that affects Black families throughout the country. The educational equity consulting firm I established has grown to include other attorneys, educators, and policy experts who share a commitment to systemic change. We work with districts, state education departments, and federal agencies to implement policies and practices that promote equity and inclusion. The demand for this work continues to grow as more communities recognize the need for comprehensive reform. My advice to other Black educators who are facing discrimination is to document everything, build networks of support, and never accept the false choice between career advancement and advocacy for equity. The legal protections exist, and there are attorneys and organizations who specialize in supporting people through these challenges. Most importantly, remember that your voice and your work matter, and that fighting for justice is never just about your individual situation. The transformation of Westfield County continues under Dr. Vasquez's leadership, with new initiatives being implemented every year to address different aspects of educational equity. The Independent Monitor's reports show steady progress in all areas, with particular improvements in academic outcomes for students of color and increased satisfaction among Black and Latino families. For Black parents navigating predominantly white school districts, my experience offers both warnings and hope. The warnings are about the reality of institutional racism and the need to advocate persistently for your children's rights. The hope is that change is possible when communities are willing to confront uncomfortable truths and implement meaningful reforms. The young Black educators I mentor today have access to resources and protections that didn't exist when I started my career. They understand their rights, they know how to document discrimination, and they have networks of support that can help them navigate challenges. Most importantly, they refuse to accept the status quo as unchangeable. My daughter Zara continues to excel academically and socially, but she does so in an environment that celebrates her achievements rather than viewing them as threatening. She has friends from all racial and ethnic backgrounds, and she's learning to be an ally to others who face different forms of discrimination. The world she's growing up in is more equitable than the one I experienced, and that gives me hope for the future. This experience taught me that personal healing and systemic change are not separate processes, but interconnected parts of the same journey toward justice. Every person who overcomes discrimination and achieves success despite systemic barriers creates possibilities for others to follow. Every institution that implements meaningful equity reforms makes it easier for other organizations to do the same. The work continues because the need continues. Racial discrimination in education persists in countless forms, from biased disciplinary policies to inequitable resource allocation to the kind of individual prejudice that my daughter experienced in her third-grade classroom. But now there are more people working to address these issues, better tools for creating change, and stronger legal protections for those who speak up. To the Black community watching this, I want you to know that your excellence is not a threat to anyone, and you should never dim your light to make others comfortable. The obstacles you face are real, but they are not insurmountable. When we support each other, document injustices, and refuse to accept discrimination as normal, we create the possibility for transformational change. To white allies who are committed to equity, I encourage you to examine your own institutions and communities for signs of the kind of discrimination I experienced. The most effective allies are those who use their privilege to challenge racism in spaces where people of color might not have access or might face retaliation for speaking up. To educators of all backgrounds, remember that our profession is fundamentally about creating opportunities for all students to reach their full potential. When we allow racial bias to affect our expectations, our policies, or our practices, we betray the core mission of education. Every child deserves teachers and administrators who see their potential and work tirelessly to help them achieve it. The victory we achieved in Westfield County belongs not just to me and my family, but to every person who has ever been told they don't belong, who has had their qualifications questioned because of their race, or who has been punished for advocating for equity and justice. It proves that resistance is possible, that systems can be changed, and that speaking truth to power can create lasting transformation. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to thank you for witnessing my experience and for caring about issues of educational equity. I encourage you to share this story with others who might benefit from hearing it, to subscribe to this channel for more content about justice and empowerment, and to join the growing movement of people who refuse to accept racism as inevitable. The road to justice is long and difficult, but it's a road we can travel together. Every step forward makes the journey easier for those who come after us, and every victory proves that change is possible when we have the courage to demand it. Our children deserve nothing less than a world where their race is never a barrier to their dreams, and it's our responsibility to create that world for them. Remember that your voice matters, your experiences are valid, and your resistance to injustice contributes to a legacy of freedom that stretches back generations and forward to generations yet to come. Stand up, speak out, and never let anyone convince you that discrimination is something you have to accept. The future depends on our willingness to fight for it, and that fight continues every day in classrooms, boardrooms, and communities across this country. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of the solution. Together, we can create educational systems that truly serve all children with the excellence and equity they deserve. The work continues, and so do we.